While Californians are beginning to feel more hopeful, the state's fiscal crisis and worries about jobs and the economy continue to weigh heavily on California voters. The state is emerging from one of the longest and deepest recessions since World War II. More than 1 million jobs were lost in California, and the unemployment rate rose to 12.6%, third highest in the nation. Personal income dropped 2.4%, the first decline since 1938. Not surprisingly, the state's general fund revenues have fallen off the cliff, plummeting more than 24% from the highs of the 2007-2008 budget to the lows of the 2009-2010 budget. And while California has begun to recover, experts predict that even if the state revenues rebound, they will be insufficient to pay for all the programs Californians have demanded and the state has committed to provide. As a result, California will have to make some difficult choices to close a near-term $25 billion budget gap, as well as deal with an ongoing structural deficit. What are the options? We'll ask state politicians from both parties, as well as a leader of the state's nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office, or the LAO, who is credited by both parties as providing accurate, unbiased information on fiscal and policy matters. We'll get their take on some of the controversial proposals that are being put forward to deal with the state's budget woes, including the governor's call for an historic state-local government realignment, the elimination of redevelopment agencies and enterprise zones, providing less of a safety net for the poor and the disabled, and paying higher taxes to spare schools from even more severe budget cuts.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Today we're coming from Sacramento, where a climactic battle is taking place that's been going on for some time, and that is on the state budget. Perhaps it's the fog of war, but most Californians lack a clear understanding of the state budget. A recent poll, for example, found that only 6% were able to correctly identify the state's largest area of spending and its largest source of revenue. As a result, a better understanding of the state budget is probably a good place to start. To help us clear up the confusion, we're fortunate to be joined by Mac Taylor, California's legislative analyst, the state's independent voice on fiscal matters. Welcome, Mr. Taylor. First I want to talk about, see if we can kind of correct some of the confusion the public has about the state budget. Where does the money come from, first of all?
Sure. Well, let's start with the state's general fund. That's its main account, and when we're talking about a budget problem, we're talking about a problem in the general fund. And about half of the revenue coming into the general fund is from personal income taxes. When you file on April 15th, both the federal and state government, that's what people pay into it. A lot of the money in the personal income tax is paid by very wealthy people. The top 1% of filers, for example, pay over 40% of total personal income taxes. The second biggest tax is the sales and use tax. And that's when you go and purchase something at the hardware store, buy a car, go to a restaurant, you pay sales tax. And that's about a third of our revenues. Now, it used to be our biggest source of funding, but in the last 3-4 decades, it has declined as the personal income tax has grown. Okay. And then we also have a corporate income tax and a variety of other smaller sources of revenue.
Now, there's also something called special funds. What are they?
Special funds just means that money is raised for a particular purpose and can only be used for a particular purpose. The biggest source of special funds are transportation related. Every time you go to the gas pump to fill up, you're paying a state gas tax. And those monies are then used for transportation purposes.
Can they only be used for transportation purposes?
Yes, they're protected by the Constitution. You also, when you register your car every year, you pay those fees. Those go for special fund purposes to pay for the Department of Motor Vehicles and the California Highway Patrol. We also have some sales taxes that are special fund in that they can only be spent for particular purposes. We have a half-cent of the sales tax that goes to criminal justice, and we have a half-cent that goes for various local realignment or programs that are administered at the county level. And then the other big source of special fund revenues are regulatory fees. And this could be if you're a contractor or a doctor, you would pay a license fee to the state.
Okay. It seems like we rely a lot on personal income tax, sales tax. Those kind of revenue sources seem to be a bit fickle. So when the economy is not doing well, they're kind of sensitive to economic ups and downs. Is that true? And if so, does that exacerbate our problems?
Yes and yes. Our most volatile, as we like to call it up here, taxes are the personal income tax and the corporate income tax. And all that means is, as the economy is changing, maybe it goes up by a couple of percent or down by a couple of percent, revenues go up or down by much, much more, by a factor of 3 or 4 or 5. And it's because of our capital gains structure and the fact that so much of our personal income tax is paid by high-income people. It tends to fluctuate much more than the economy.
Okay, well, what about, let's take a look at the other side of the equation. That's how monies are spent. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Certainly. On the general fund side, again, this is what we talk about when we are referring to the state's budgetary problem. Far and away the biggest category is education. About 40% of the budget goes to local school districts, K-12, your elementary high school districts, or to community colleges. And then a good chunk goes to pay for University of California and the California State University system. So as you can see from the chart, well over half goes to education in some form. The other biggest program after that is in health, and that's our state Medi-Cal program. This provides health care services to low-income people, and it's been a large and rapidly growing program. Also, the state general fund supports our prison systems, our courts, and various other health and social services programs.
It's interesting, in that poll that I referenced earlier, people are under the misimpression that our prison system is the most expensive expenditure for state government. Where does it rank? Do you know where it ranks in state expenditures?
It's about 10% of our total budget.
So quite a bit smaller than education.
Oh, much, much smaller than that, or our Medi-Cal program. I think what maybe some people are referring to is that the corrections budget has grown very rapidly over the last 25 years. So it has taken up a larger piece of the budget, but it is still relatively small.
Now, what about these special fund expenditures?
Well, in some ways, we've already talked about how they're spent, since they can only be spent for particular purposes. Okay. So, for example, on transportation, those gas taxes can only be spent to repair our roads. A lot of the money goes down to locals and is spent on local roads. The health and social services is basically that half-cent sales tax that is used for local mental health and other social services programs. And you may remember the state voted for a millionaire's tax a few years back, and that's used to support mental health programs.
Okay. Now, I want to ask you about the structural deficit. You hear a lot of talk about the structural deficit. What is that, and how does it play a role in California's chronic fiscal mess? We've only got about a minute.
Sure. Well, a structural problem is when you basically are on an ongoing basis are spending more than you're taking in.
Okay, well, that's a simple definition.
That's pretty simple.
You know, there's one chart actually I wanted to get in here, and that was on do we have a revenue problem or a spending problem? I know you had one other chart here that I wanted to talk about. Could you talk about that for a moment?
Well, we certainly had a projected budget problem over the 2000s, most years, and it's been rather large. I would say we probably have both. We have a spending problem in that during our good times we probably committed more than we were able to support on an ongoing basis, but clearly the recent recession has taken a big hit on our revenue base. We lost about a quarter of our revenue base in this great recession, as they're now calling it.
Okay, well, when we come back, we'll discuss this year's budget and some of the more controversial proposals by Governor Brown to close a $25 billion budget gap. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report.